So what happens if we have a 3-equation system? Well, our goal is the same. We need ones on the diagonal from upper left to lower right with zeros everywhere else. And yes, this is always the goal. Okay, so we set up our augmented matrix. 1, -1, 1, 8. Make sure it's in the correct form. It needs to be a x, then a y, then a z, and a constant on the other side of the equal sign. If it's not, you have to get it in that form before you can make your matrix. 2, 3, -1, -2. 3, -2, -9, 9. So we want to get this goal over here. Now, just like with a 2 by 2, we need a very specific order. First we get the 1, then we get these zeros, both of them. Then we get this 1, then we get these zeros. Then we get this 1, then we get these zeros. It's a very organized process for ending up with this goal. Well, we already have that first 1. So how can we get zeros here? Well, let's focus on row 2. What do you add to 2 to get 0? -2. -2 times the row with the 1 in it, so that's row 1. We're going to add it back to row 2 to get a new row 2. Let's see if I can use lots of different colors on this one. We can actually do 2 things at one time when we have this type of matrix. We also want to get a 0 here, right? We want to make both of these equal to 0. Well, what do I add to 3 to get 0? -3. Also add it to the row, or multiply it by the row with the 1 in it. Add it to the row where you want the 0, and that'll give you a new row where you want the 0. Okay, so let's see what happens. This says we're getting a new row 2 and a new row 3, which means row 1 is going to stay the same. Now row 2 becomes -2 times row 1 plus row 2. -2 times row 1 plus row 2. -2 times 1 is -2, plus 2 is 0. -2 times -1 is 2, plus 3 is 5. -2 times 1 is -2, minus 1 is -3. -2 times 8 is -16, minus 2 is -18. Now we do that with row 3 as well, but this time we multiply row 1 by -3 and add it to row 3. So -3 times 1 is -3, plus 3 is 0. -3 times -1 is 3, minus 2 is 1. -3 times 1 is -3, minus 9 is -12. -3 times 8 is -24. -24 plus 9 is -15. So we have our first step. We have column 1 done. Now we move to the next column. We need this to be a 1 in the middle. Well, looking at this, if we were to switch these 2 rows, wouldn't we get a 1 there? And it wouldn't mess up our zeros, right? You only want to switch rows if when you do it, it doesn't mess up what you got the first time. Like, we can switch these 2, but if we were to switch 1 and 3 or something like that, then it messes up our first column, and we don't want to do that. We want to keep those numbers in their correct places. So for this next step, I'm actually going to switch row 2 and row 3. If you don't do that, it'll still work. For example, if you divide row 2 by 5, it'll still work. This way we just have less fractions. And we may still get fractions, but at least we're postponing it a little bit, right? So let's switch rows 2 and 3. That means row 1 still stays the same. So switching those two, we have a 0, 1, negative 12, negative 15, and a 0, 5, negative 3, negative 18. So we have that 1 in the middle. Now we need zeros above and below it. So here and here we need zeros. Well, what do you add to negative 1 to make 0? You add a 1. 1 times row 2, because that's where the 1 is that I just got, right? 1 times row 2 plus row 1 is my new row 1. And we need to get rid of that 5 as well. What do you add to 5 to get 0? A negative 5. So a negative 5 times that row 2, that's where my 1 is, plus row 3 this time is a new row 3. According to this, I'm changing rows 1 and 3, which means row 2 stays the same. Okay, let's do that row operation. 1 times row 2 plus row 1. So really you're just adding rows 1 and 2 together to get a new row 1. 1 times this, 1 times 0 is 0, plus 1 is 1. 1 times 1 is 1, minus 1 is 0. 1 times negative 12 is negative 12, plus 1 is negative 11. 1 times negative 15 is negative 15, plus 8 is negative 7. Now we do row 3. Negative 5 times row 2 plus row 3. Negative 5 times 0 is 0, plus 0 is 0. Negative 5 times 1 is negative 5, plus 5 is 0. Negative 5 times negative 12 is a positive 60, minus 3 is 57. Then we have negative 5 times negative 15 is 75. I lost my place. Negative 5 times row 2. So negative 5 times negative 15, that's going to be a positive 75, minus 18 is 57. So we have the first two columns in the correct order. Now we move to the last column. We need this to be a 1, and then we need these to be zeros. Well, to make that a 1, all you have to do is divide that row by 57. So row 3 divided by 57 is a new row 3. So let's go this way. That means rows 1 and 2 will stay the same. But row 3, we divide all these by 57. Well, that'll give me a 0, a 0, a 1, and a 1. For the next step, I need both of these to be 0. So let's look at row 2. What do I add to negative 12 to get 0? 12. The one that I need is in row 3. So 12 times row 3 plus row what? So row 2 will give me a new row 2. And we can also get rid of that negative 11. What do you add to negative 11 to get 0? 11. So 11 times that row with the 1 in it. So 11 times row 3 plus what? Plus row 1 is a new row 1. Okay, let's do those row operations. We're going up this time. This says I'm getting a new row 1 and a new row 2, which means row 3 stays the same. Okay, so we can start either place, doesn't matter. 11 times row 3 plus row 1 is a new row 1. Thus 11 times this one plus this one. 11 times 0 is 0, plus 1 is 1. 11 times 0 is 0, plus 0 is 0. 11 times 1 is 11. Minus 11 is 0. 11 times 1 is 11. Minus 7 is 4. Now let's work with row 2. That's 12 times row 3 plus row 2. 12 times 0 is 0, plus 0 is 0. 12 times 0 is 0, plus 1 is 1. 12 times 1 is 12, minus 12 is 0. 12 times 1 is 12, minus 15 is negative 3. At this point, we have x equals 4, y equals negative 3, z equals 1. So our solution is the point 4, negative 3, 1. And of course you can check that by substituting it back into all three equations and make sure it works for all three.